So, David, I have to be honest with you.
Okay, what's that?
I'm officially confused as to everything that's happening across the federal government, from the legislative branch to the executive branch to the judicial branch. Um, I'm trying to
You're
think of
not
the
the
easiest.
you're not the only one.
Yeah, I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse. I mean, can we maybe just think about the next couple of months? So maybe between Memorial Day and the July 4th holiday. Can you just give us a sense if we were to start maybe with the judicial branch, what should we be paying attention to?
Well, Todd, you're not the only person. Everyone's trying to keep a track of this. The truth of the matter is, I think more of us understand this than we do not in DC. And I think that is a little bit frightening. But there are a lot of places where there's not a great deal of clarity, and I would not put that on our analysis. I would just put that on the realities of what's happening. So let's start with the courts. Okay, so we've had over what, 200? I can't even, I've lost, I don't even bother with the count of executive orders anymore. It's like, last time I looked, it was over 150. I think it's grown some more. But the point is that most all of them have been challenged in the courts. And we're at kind of like a mixture level where a lot of them were challenged and dealt with at the basic federal court level and the entry level in the federal system. And a lot of them got, they were placed on hold by the courts, and those challenges about those holds have been working their way through the appellate process. And in some places, they were upheld to be held, and in other places they were said, no, we're going to send them back down to the federal court and basically say, hey, you got to be a lot more specific about how long this should last and what exactly is covered. So they're basically they're supporting the federal courts in the system, but they're also basically saying the president does have certain authorities, and we have to recognize that. So there's two things in particular that I think are really important that are going to come out in this period that you just left that are actually from the Supreme Court. And that's going to make a big difference, really, about how things will go. But first of all, the Supreme Court has taken up at the end of April the issue of the Affordable Care Act's preventative services mandate. And this is the one that was kind of interesting because it also had to do with the Preventative Services Task Force and its ability to make certain determinations about what should have to be covered under the Affordable Care Act with no extra charges as a part of preventative care. And preventative care has been talked about a lot, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point that particularly within the sort of Make America Healthy Again mandate that the administration is pursuing, is represented by the HHS Secretary, RFK Jr. I just can't imagine a scenario where there won't be a simultaneous discussion around preventative care and how best to encourage that across particularly chronic diseases.
So we expect the court to rule on this in June. And so before they go to their July 5th, July 4th recess. So that's going to be pretty important. It's going to shape the weight of making sure preventative care is going to be paid for at a certain level. And it's also going to shape a lot of what may be coming out of the administration and out of the Department of Health and Human Services. The second Supreme Court case that I think is really going to make a big difference, and it's not just because of the subject of it, it's what is underlying the question, and that is the one of birthright citizenship. Okay, so that was taken up by the court very rapidly recently, and you could tell this was something they were very concerned about. So it was a very lively discussion in the court about about birthright citizenship, and a lot of the justices were saying, birthright citizenship is very clearly an important issue. But the other part of this, and I think this is probably very clever positioning by the administration about what they want to see underlined, is they took up this case, but they also filed the question to the Supreme Court. Do the lower courts have the authority to do nationwide injunctions against their executive orders? And so this court case may be less significant about birthright citizenship, which, if I'm betting, they're going to uphold with a couple dissents. but it's going to be a question about whether the lower courts can enjoin the entire nation for an executive order from the president. And I think that one is going to be a lot of splitting hairs and trying to figure out how to like make this work all the way around. And I'm predicting that will be kind of a messy decision. But the two of those are going to have pretty big stakes for what's going to happen in the year ahead.
So maybe using that just to move to the executive branch and just talk a little bit about what's happening, sort of particularly among regulatory issues. So again, we're in this time frame between Memorial Day and Fourth of July. Where should we be focusing?
Okay, first and foremost, for our listeners, you are still going to get a proposed rule for the ESRD benefit in Medicare, the end-stage renal disease benefit, which has the prospective payment system and the quality incentive program. So you're still going to get that. I don't expect it to be real spicy. I don't think it's going to have a whole lot of innovation because I think a lot of things are under review at the moment. So we will get that. And I think we will probably, maybe not by July 4th, but shortly thereafter, we will also get uh, the Medicare physician fee service rule, which again, I do not think will be as, a terribly a big move because when we get to the legislative side, there is something being proposed there in the reconciliation package. So that's a very different issue as to how far they'll go on that without that being out the door. So what, you and I've talked about, Lauren, you and I have talked about is while regulatory rulemaking is going to continue, the trend is already out there, and the trend is that we're going to see a lot more RFIs, and those RFIs are going to be asking questions that they are going to use, you know, in their in their ideas and their proposals for things that they want to renovate. And there's a big one out there right now that has to do with identifying regulations that you think are onerous and that they could be removed without causing harm. Because there's a big push to, lower the level of regulation in our society. We do have a fairly heavily, regulated society. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, bad thing. It's just it is a reality, and there are a lot of people who feel like it's burdensome. So we shall see how that all goes. But another example of that is recently ASN took up a review of an RFI that was put up by the Commerce Department, not HHS. And in that review, they were asking whether or not there should be trade tariffs or other trade initiatives for drug lines that might be of a national security level for the United States. So what we did, along with some of the other people in the kidney community, is we prepared a list of all of the medications in both the ESRD program, transplant, and so forth that are currently being used for kidney patients, and basically detailed why we do not believe they need tariffs and why we do not believe that there's any threat to national security in their supply chain line. So we are hoping that they will not decide to go in and look at these. That's a little bit of an issue that we, really would prefer that they stay out of because there's no evidence of that really in the whole line of drugs and that are being used for kidney patients. Um,
So
then,
David, just to
all right,
two quick questions. One is, of course, you're talking about requests for information. Since this is something you have helped ASN respond to some of these requests, can you just sort of walk us through how you think about these issues and how you think about responding on behalf of an organization like ASN?
well, it's not unlike what doctors are asked to do, which is first and foremost, do no harm. So, if you're being asked a whole bunch of questions, um, you got to stop and wonder and ask yourself, why am I being asked these questions? And it's not just because they like us and want to know what's going on in kidney, it's because they have something in mind. And so you got to look at that, and then you got to look at what is, the status of whatever we're looking at in current law or in current regulations. And, that they should not be in conflict, but that's not to say that they sometimes aren't. Sometimes they are in conflict. And the regulations are not as well aligned with the statute as we might like. And in this case, this one was interesting because we worked with a lot of people in the kidney community. We also brought in um, a trade law firm that could help with those particular trade issues. But then the nephrologist in our group really took the lead on let's go through all the medications, let's go through all the treatments, let's look at what's out there, which ones are critical, which ones are really vulnerable, and and quite frankly, we haven't really seen any of these drugs in the nephrology space being used as kind of like a trade lever or any kind of product war. And that's what really led the groups in the kidney community to say, please do not try to implement trade policy on those kidney drugs. We don't need it. There's no real reason for it. So, and we evaluated on the website, ASM website, evaluated what are the drugs, what's their path of origin. And so, for example, there's a lot of drugs that have become generics, particularly in transplant. And I know what they're thinking. We want to bring all these drugs and their manufacturing back to the United States. But generic drugs, they're much cheaper. And most of the time, even though you might be doing kind of advanced drugs in the United States, you're producing your generics elsewhere. And that's because it's much less expensive, and the market doesn't pay for generics the way it would need to be paid for if they were being manufactured in the United States. So you got to really look at the whole picture and what are the downstream consequences.
So, since we're on the topic of regulatory issues, I know usually around just before the 4th of July holiday, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services will release proposed rules, both in terms of physician payment and then the ESRD program, the Medicare ESRD programs, PPS and QUIP. Do you anticipate that same timeline this year?
Yes, I do. And I think the remaining big question for this period is going to be what are the timelines for comments? Because there's been some question about how much public comments are going to be used by this administration. I don't think any of these programs are going to be impacted by that because they are dictated by statute. So we normally have a 60-day period of turnaround before we make comments. We shall see exactly how that stands up. We don't know yet.
Um, when you say that, what you're saying is basically that the administration is less likely to be influenced to make changes on proposed rules by the feedback they get from the community. So sort of what they put out as proposed rules is likely to be near final.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that is likely to be the case. But that has become more and more the case in healthcare, which is that there's not a big movement from proposed to final. We did have a big change last year in what was proposed for AKI payments when people were discharged and allowed to go to home. That, after a lot of explanation, a lot of work, CMS realized that the numbers that they were using just weren't realistic. And so they really dialed back what they were going to be doing in that particular case. So I think there's just a lot about the process that is going to be ongoing, but it's going to be at times a little different.
Hmm. That's really interesting. I guess I never really thought about it in this moment. As you know, you and I have talked a lot about the Chevron decision and sort of the role of Congress now and being very specific about what it wants out of specific legislation. It occurs to me that that changes how the proposed rule process works, doesn't it?
It does. I think this is one of the strategies I think that could be risky because if you don't really allow public comment in, that's going to run in the face of what should be the precedent of the Chevron decision. Because if you were the Chevron decision saying don't take just the word of the bureaucrats, but also the experts. And so if you're going to be asking questions about ESRD or any AKI or any of these particular kidney disease situations and how they're handled,
Huh.
ASN's members are the experts.
Well, in our remaining time, maybe we should shift to the legislative branch. Tell me about this big, beautiful bill.
Okay, you said like okay, I kind of this is it's been a long time. It's been 46 years since the release of Pinball Wizard, which is one of my favorite songs growing up. Pinball was The Who, and then Elton John's version in the movie Tommy. I
Lauren, do you know even what he's talking about? Because I remember seeing Tommy live in the theater, and I was not very old, and it was let's just say it was a mind-blowing experience, and we'll leave it at that.
I actually do. My dad, thankfully, cultured me with these references during my childhood.
Well, thanks for aging David and me. We appreciate
oh,
it. But
well,
I'm not sure how you're going to tie this back to Pinball Wizard. I'm
well,
very excited.
The pinball was. I'm not. My point is, I'm trying to figure out who ends up being dubbed the pinball wizard when this is all said and done. Because it's binking back and forth across. It's just you can see the lights going, you can see the levers moving and everything, and you're like wondering how on earth somebody gets to the score they want and they win, and everyone's happy about it, and it's fantastic. And who gets to be that wizard? Right now, I am a little doubtful about what happens when we get that big beautiful bill over to the Senate. They're talking about pulling it apart in different pieces and dealing with it. So who knows exactly how that's going to go. If you like to watch this kind of stuff, it will be a fun summer for that. You will not be bored.
Yeah, I guess my question, and I don't know how to ask this, but I was really impressed in the with the Biden administration and the previous two Congresses. Senator Manchin from West Virginia was very effective at being in the majority, both in terms of the White House and the Senate, but using his power as a senator to help shape policy in a direction that he wanted. And I'm just surprised, I guess, that the same thing's not happening with the group of five or six Republican senators who should be able to do the same, but to date haven't. So, for instance, Senator Collins was very vocal about her concerns around NIH cuts. Why isn't there more effectiveness in terms of these types of blocks, given what we learned from Senator Manchin, which I know is just an example, that's happened
Well,
throughout
I'm
history.
gonna push back on you on this one. I think we need to wait and see. I think Senator Collins, Senator Cassidy, there's a couple from New York, excuse me, there are a couple members from North Carolina and some other areas. I think it's yet to be seen because I think that when this big, beautiful bill gets over to the Senate, it's a whole new deal. And the Senate, you and I both been on the Hill, and the Senate has a way of folding its arms and sitting back and going, okay, go ahead. You want to send all that over here to us? We're going to deal with it in our way, in our time. And that's the way the Senate deals with the House quite often. And so I think it'll be very interesting. I think that what comes back out of this by the Senate will be something that probably President Trump is happy with, but maybe not necessarily everyone in the Republican Party in the House will be happy with.
So just to clarify what you're saying is right now the discussion's taking place in the House will present the Senate with a bill, and then the process starts all over again. And for us to be making any judgments about the Senate right now is unfair because they haven't really had an opportunity to have their discussion in depth.
Well, I'll say one thing as we wrap up here. This summer, when you talk about getting to the Senate, this is going to be like the playground for what would be a year in advance normally. So this would be enter the midterm elections, except for rather than them entering the summer before them, they're going to be entering this summer because you've got particularly the Medicaid cuts possibly on the table here. They're being looked at. They greatly impact red states. Then you've got the CBO, Congressional Budget Office estimate of what it would take for 10 years of extension of the ACA tax credits. And that will be 335 billion over 10 years. And guess what? It is estimated that 76% of the people affected by those cuts or those remaining are predominantly all found in red states. So there's going to be some real soul searching in the Senate this summer.
Well, why don't we stop there? Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
This podcast is copyrighted by the American Society of Nephrology. All rights reserved. All content in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be medical advice. This podcast should not be used in a medical emergency or for the diagnosis or treatment of any medical condition. Please consult your doctor or other qualified healthcare professional if you have any questions about any medical condition or before taking any drug, changing your diet, or commencing or discontinuing any course of treatment. Thank you for listening to this podcast from the American Society of Nephrology.